Good afternoon. Yeah. Good afternoon, all participants, our lecturers, and students from Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Diponegoro University. Thank you for coming to the Forum Diskusi Ilmiah Perencanaan Fdip 2022 Seri 1. Today, the topic is about Metro Java 2045, a model for Desa-Kota and use planning. Today we have speaker from Bapak Neville Mars, and then as the speaker, and also Pak Fadjar as our lecturer to give a comment about the presentation about the Metro Java 2045. And first, I would like to introduce you all to our speakers. I'm sorry, a little bit trouble with the share screen. So the first, our speaker is Mr. Neville Mars, PhD from the director of the Dynamic City Foundation, and also a non-profit research platform investigating about rapid urbanization in Asia. He working across skills and disciplines that the DCF produce projects, so many projects related to such as social mobility, urbanization, and he also one of the authors of the book of the Chinese Dream, a Society Under Construction. And in the past, Mr. Mars and DCF has broadly collaborated with so many stakeholders, like from the powerhouse company, Tianhua, RMIT, TU Delft, and many more. And the next speaker is Mr. Fadjar Mardiansjah, our lecturer at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. His research focus on sustainable regional urbanization and small towns and cities development, metropolitanization of smart city, as well as regional inequality. And to make it short, I will give the time to Mr. Neville to present your presentation. Mr. Neville, time and screen is yours.
Great. Is this okay? Can people hear me now? If I use the mic? Unmute? Yeah. So just testing if everybody can hear me. Maybe somebody online can give me a thumbs up. Perfect, great. Well, let me start by saying it's very exciting to be here after, you know, almost 1.5 years talking with M.PWK online with the challenges of working across, three very different environments, Holland, China, and Indonesia. It's wonderful to be in the same room. I wanted to share a little background, not just talk about Metro Java 2045, but instead to share a little bit of our research on China as well, to indicate that the peri-urban landscape, or this kind of muddled urban condition, is not necessarily unique to Indonesia and the Desa-Kota. but rather is a phenomenon that is taking increasing prominence in our field as, let's say, the Global South is becoming taking center stage in urban studies and in development itself. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Okay. Yeah. That one, sorry. That works, right? Yeah, thank you, Intan, for this kind introduction and taking care of me these days. It's true, we work on a sort of a tandem platform, and because of time constraints, I will try to do this at a Chinese speed. We have been active as, let's say, commercial planners and architects, doing the type of projects that you can really only do in China, this kind of large-scale urban development. However, working on these type of projects immediately from the start in 2003, it became clear that there is a lot of really fundamental contradictions and conflicts that are not being addressed and that are kind of inherent and intrinsic to the type of urbanization that we're kind of forced to deliver. So we set up the Dynamic City Foundation in order to kind of have a moment of clarity next to all the production, right? And to have a bit of reflection. And that indeed started with the work on the book of the Chinese Dream, which had as a premise that a type of urban urbanization, an urban model, will generate a type of city, will in turn generate a type of society. So there is a correlation to the way cities take shape and the way society takes shape. That is particularly pertinent in a place such as China, where you're literally building these cities from scratch. And as a result, which the government clearly wanted, build a society from scratch. Now, that model, I will argue in this breakdown, is kind of premised around the idea of urgency and control. So on the one hand, there is an immediate need, a great urgency to respond, as we see here in Indonesia. And therefore, we need models that allow for great control to actually manifest those aspirations in space. Well, we all know what that looks like. This type of the mass production of urban space, right? The repetition both in residential but also in industrial space, which in this case is Shanghai, can look rather bleak. And of course, in infrastructural space. What you get is, in the case of Beijing, this is really brutal superpositioning of new systems on top of fragile old systems. Again, this is a theme that I think is very important today in Indonesia, the top-down planning of large, heavy infrastructural systems on top of a fragile, informal, local conditions. So, of course, top-down planning, according to, let's say, the Chinese model, is very comfortable because it's extremely clear and crisp, and you can go very fast because everything is easy to draft, easy to calculate, easy to invest in. But you're also kind of defying opportunities to interpret where and what you're doing in your environment. So this is Ordos near the desert. You really see how this template, this uniform spatial system, is simply being projected on top of this landscape without any reflection, without responding to the environment. Even the most ambitious new projects, this is Xi'an, that is kind of the new mega city planned top-down just south of Beijing. even that new city, which in my opinion kind of echoes the ambitions with the new capital here, is at the mercy of this kind of top-down thinking. So you have a ready-made template that you then project onto the map to get really what is, on the one hand, technically an advanced system, but I would argue spatially a very rigid and simplistic system. You see here, it does really everything, and in that sense, China is rather sophisticated. It has the underground station, it has guided vehicle systems, it has basically everything that your smart city should have, with all the big money that China can throw at it and the expertise. But in reality, that new entity is not able to thrive within the, let's say, organic ecological sphere of northeastern China. So the simple way to put it is, I would argue we should look at this system, the old, traditional, outdated grid city, for instance, reflected in the roads here at night. And then smart cities are simply taking that old system and superimposing new technologies on top of that system. So the smart city is kind of like new tech on top of old urbanism. That as a model is what I would argue defines Chinese urbanism at large, which of course now is being replicated across more than 100 countries in the world. Here you see a little map. It's not just urbanization, it's also industrialization, very much, of course, in Africa, but also along infrastructural corridors and also even academic and intellectual fields. So that kind of initial framework of we need to build capacity and we need to have systems of control to implement that is still being applied and is now being rolled out far across the borders of the Chinese state. Now, unfortunately, I believe after 20 years in China that these systems of control are outdated. If we look at two cities here, Chengdu and Chongqing, I want to show you the real development in a sort of organic process of 18 years of growth. Each slide is 1 year of development. There we go, very quickly. So 1991, 92, etc. Within this landscape of these mega cities, as they are evolving very rapidly, growing and expanding very rapidly, every single square meter is officially planned. Every single square meter is officially drafted, blueprinted, and accredited by the government. So you would argue it should be exactly according to plan. But as this image hopefully begins to indicate, in reality, it reveals a far more organic condition. These two cores have blurred the edges, have grown towards each other, have kind of defied all this rigid planning and all these strict orthogonal systems. Instead, what I would argue you see is a kind of, let's say, gravitational pull towards these cores and the city taking control rather than the planner being in control. Because I'm Dutch, I'd come up with a lot of funny terms. In this case, I would call that MUD, meaning a market-driven, unintentional development. It is driven by the market. It is fully accepted by the state, and yet it is not following our initial intentions. That brings us kind of to a new chapter. China has, in a way, achieved what it wished for. It wanted to build a society from scratch by building cities from scratch, and it has done so. But now we are looking at the kind of the wreckage and also at the the ongoing impact of these new cities. And I would argue that brings us to a whole new chapter, the chapter of the Anthropocene, which of course is a kind of a global phenomenon where man-made influence is taking control. In the case of future growth, we could generally say that most activity is still happening in Asia. The big bubbles, India, China, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, are where the action is. However, the yellow indicates that the higher rates of urbanization are not being met. That begins to kind of reveal that growth is not happening in compact cores, but rather in a new format of peri-urban landscapes. If you look at this map, that begins to become much clearer still. These kind of light colored rings indicate that the growth is happening at that peripheral level, at that peri-urban territory. You could argue that there is a Asian urbanism at play, that within this bubble where there's 4 billion people living today, most of whom are urbanized in some form, meaning maybe not in the traditional sense of living in a urban core, but rather in an urban setting, an urbanized setting, such as the Desa-Kota, such as I'll show in a minute, the Chinese version of the Desa-Kota, the peri-urban landscape. That means that the blur, or rather the shift from pure urban core versus countryside, this dichotomy of urban versus non-urban is now outdated. Instead, we have to begin to look at things holistically. Excuse me. We, as urban planners, need to consider the long term, and it's all about the 10 billion people that all need to be fed, which means there is a space requirement that deals really with water, air, and soil in one in order to create enough food for all these people. So as climate change and other challenges related to climate change are increasing, very much felt also here in Indonesia, storm surge, flooding, drought, erosion, etc. This holistic perspective is becoming critical. It is really the end, as far as I'm concerned, of a singular urban urban vision. The planner as city builder is kind of over, is dead. This, I think, rather persuasive GIS map really drives home that argument, revealing all the really intricate surface water systems. In this case, I hope you can all recognize, of course, the shape of China, reveals that this is an edgeless city. It's a city, a system that goes on and on in every direction. And of course, this is global. It goes on to India here and to the rest of Asia and to the rest of the world. So wherever there is pollution in this system, it will travel. Wherever there are issues of flooding or drought, it will travel, etc. There is no longer an isolated approach. It has to be a regional and super regional and ultimately global. So then what can we do in terms of planning? Is it really too complex, as some people have argued, to even begin to make this effort? I think there is still some sort of hierarchy to be found. If this is my simple little diagram of what planners are generally talking about, then you could say there's an aspect of sustainability, which is rather technical, maybe dealing with renewables and food. Then there is an aspect of community, which is more about knowledge, heritage, management, etc. But at the very center is the issue of land use. And land use can make our lives, at least at an intellectual level, a bit simpler. I would argue land use begins to introduce hierarchy in how we should operate, what our methodologies should be. On the one hand, what I would call space economy is our main objective, and on the other hand, time economy. That means that land use gives us priority in understanding challenges and also addressing them. For space economy, the most simplistic way of saying would be we need to be as compact as possible, preserve land use. In terms of time economy, we need to be as well connected as possible in order to actually streamline and limit and optimize the way that space is then being used. That kind of analogy means that this type of map of China with dots, cities as dots, is utterly outdated. Instead, we should be looking at the space in between these cities, very much similar to the space in between the cities in Indonesia and the Desa-Kota. In China, we have about 6 of these mega urban fields or peri-urban landscapes. There's many terms, doesn't really matter. GIS can kind of trace them quite well. Here you see it in light green, and can even begin to indicate where the growth is. In the darker areas, there is much growth. In the lighter areas, it's rather static. That kind of object in the north east of China between Shanghai and Beijing is almost one territory, one metropolitan space. And yet it is not really acknowledged. It's not really fully adhered to as an environment to be planned or to be understood as a space that we can operate on. Why? Because, of course, it is occurring largely below the radar, just as the Desa-Kota. These singular dots are individual villages. So you could literally walk from one village to the next, to the next, to the next, and each village is compact still. It's still densely populated, and if you zoom out, they kind of blur together to form this larger entity. That entity sits within the space of China in a historical location where, of course, the land was most fertile. That's where the people would live. That's where now the urbanization, as you see in red here, is the fastest, is the most aggressive, which means that urbanization is competing with agricultural space and agricultural productivity directly. They are competing for the same space. And that's a challenge that I believe is also, Indonesia is also facing, the competition between agricultural productivity and, let's say, urban requirements. So to fast forward, my conclusion is that we need a new way of planning, dare I say, of unplanning. We need to kind of think beyond the city, think beyond models of expansion, and instead think in terms of networks and time-based solutions. Because in the scope of China, you really cannot find the edge of the city anymore. So if you don't have an edge, well, then it doesn't make any sense to say, okay, I'm going to do a smart city or a satellite city or a new town, because they are all absorbed within the larger network. I introduce here, sorry, it's in Chinese, but it basically means green edge. I introduce here a new kind of formula that later on we kind of replicated in Metro Java 2045. The formula is simple. We look at each core, measure how far you can get within a 1-hour travel radius, no matter what mode of transportation. Again, these are the same 2 cities, Chengdu and Chongqing. So bus, train, BRT, walking, biking, high-speed rail, everything connected. And then you kind of begin to map these things in these types of bubbles of 1-hour travel localities. You can do that for the whole country, as we've done for China, which creates these kind of network bubbles within which you have the beautiful condition that there is already accessibility, there is already economic development and growth, because there are cities. And there is a reason to expand within these bubbles, because you would use your infrastructure to the maximum of your potential. So within these bubbles, you would not have to build a single new city. You would not have to build a single new satellite, not a single new town. Funny side note, my English name is of course Neville, which means new ville, new village, new city in French, which is translated in my Chinese name, Xincheng, which means new city. And my big life's mission is to prevent the construction of all new cities. Within that network thinking, you can then start to solve issues of renewable energy. This is where the black areas is where the consumption is. Then we start looking at the areas of production in the desert for solar, in the southeast for biofuels, etc., etc. And you can then hope to bring those that industrial scale of renewable harvesting through these ultra high voltage cables to the places of consumption. This is kind of still future thinking, but in the case of China, you have that network in place. So there is the foundation of a smart grid already, which is quite promising. More important for me today is that it fits the idea of this kind of holistic approach where landscape, network, and urban field all work in one model, in one vision. So the spikes you see in China, with the darker blue dense areas in between these spikes, will, in my opinion, could very much reflect the conditions we see locally here in Central Java. So to recap the Chinese part, and then I'll talk only about Indonesia. I see this split between a top-down, let's say a global approach in planning of smart cities, eco-cities, new towns, etc., versus a bottom-up approach, a community approach of maybe upgrading of slums, favela, ghetto, Desa-Kota, urban villages, Taobao villages. What I do not see is these two worlds, these two ideologies meeting. They are split, they are separate, they are at odds with one another, and they really, as far as I can tell, have not been able to find a way to be married into a new model. And I think that's where the future lies, that's where our challenges are. Which brings me to the kind of midway point of the Metro Java 2045 project. So at the bottom here, you see all the partners, quite a few. As mentioned, we've been working on it for quite a while. It's important to note that it's a very fluid kind of process, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. I think that's important. We have a complex set of challenges that doesn't have a fixed solution, and instead it requires a tinkering and adjusting of the process itself, rather than this kind of blueprint approach that is common in China. So the mission ahead, if there is a real clear mission, is to deliver an integrated model for the, let's say, rural-urban continuum of Java. And our case study specifically is Central Java. We defined a 130 by 130 kilometer square. And within that square, we have a 10 by 10 kilometer case study around the Borobudur. And within that 10 by 10, we have actually one specific village that will be our pilot project. Now, if we are successful, then we have, through both very theoretical approaches and data-driven approaches, and very much hands-on workshopping with local communities, we have begun to kind of define a more integrated model that merges top-down and bottom-up development. But there are many challenges ahead, obviously. The first is that the type of urbanization, as far as I can tell, is not so clear certainly not in Java. There is no, as there was in China, there is no clear shift from the countryside to the big cities. It's much more diffused. Even UN Habitat and the World Bank are at odds in their formulations of what's going on in Java. I'm pretty sure your data here locally is better. The conclusion I have is that it's a muddled picture with movement in multiple directions. That means growth is kind of happening ad hoc, in situ, at every scale simultaneously. That changes our objective, our challenge from the traditional classical kind of top-down planning challenge towards something that deals much more with Indonesia becoming globalized, being networked into the global system, into the framework of globalized nations and cities, which ultimately just means that lifestyles are changing. Here you see our 130 block, just for the data scientists among us. We particularly liked this site, not only because we love working with our partners, but because there was this unique moment of a shift from toll road, an upgrading from the national roads to toll road here in Orange. And we wanted to kind of test if that upgrading would really fundamentally improve the local conditions or maybe just change them. And if there was improvement, for whom, and was that would it impact the landscape itself? Of course, this would all be speculation, so we would need to have a solid analytical foundation. Here you see the population density curve, Yogyakarta at the bottom here, Semarang where we're now at the top. What would happen in this landscape? What are the, we wanted to kind of ask, what are the main drivers for this environment? You could simply say, okay, there is an industrial component, sure, for instance, towards the east. There is an ambition for, let's say, global tourism that's around Borobudur towards the west, northwest. And then there is the national upgrading of logistic and infrastructural networks, the international airport, but also the tollways, etc. So these three general, let's say, components of urbanization would drive the future of the landscape in between those anchor points. How? I'm really eager to discuss with all of you. We have a few ideas that we begin to feel comfortable about. I'm quite cautious that we know generally what's going on. Obviously, it's a midway point. This is very much a work in progress, but I will share with you some of our initial conclusions. So there is micro scale growth. We've done the mapping. It is happening. There is these kind of ribbon formations along the corridors, the main national roads, especially the access points. There is, let's say, rural industrialization happening. There are small clusters forming. There are larger, really clearly designed or implemented moments of global urbanism, such as these. But there are also more subtle land use shifts. For that, we need to kind of look at the GIS map more closely. and then compare those mappings to how they relate to the network, existing accessibility network, and what happens actually on the ground. So we feel we cannot solely rely on big data. It's really about sort of triangulation. We model with the data, then we interpret, and then we look at the reality on the ground, and we try to feed back and see if it really makes sense. Because beyond that, this kind of very clear top-down big development, the small is the hardest to trace, and maybe it's actually the most important. So in Indonesia too, I would argue you have a similar dichotomy of global, local, rural, urban, formal, informal, large, piecemeal, etc. That kind of dichotomy would allow us maybe to paint the picture of a doom versus dream scenario, because ultimately planning, unfortunately, is the discipline of projecting into the future, even though that is factually not possible. No, we are not fortune tellers, and we will never be fortune tellers, but we are forced to be at least predictive. So I felt quite comfortable with stating that the Desa-Kota, let's say in around 2005, was still in a very pristine original state, very much unchanged. And we've set that as a sort of a benchmark of an ideal kind of almost perfect condition. And everything that moves away from that benchmark is either doom or dream scenario. To me, in conclusion, that doom scenario would mean a sort of a hyper suburbia. It would mean fragmentation, dispersion, and scattering of land use types and activity. The dream scenario, maybe a Desa-Kota 2.0, would mean a contiguous landscape where all these systems are intricately connected with compact development. What are the internal forces that would, there are many, but what are the ones that we can latch on to make it super simple? We felt that we could argue fragmentation is directly related to the main concern of road proliferation. And on the other hand, contiguousness or connectedness is related to maybe something, which I don't know exactly what it means, but some form of integrated land use planning. Okay, that's a premise, right? Just an initial premise. That premise is much harder than it sounded when we formulated that, because it means that red, green, and blue, or urban, agricultural, and natural systems have to then begun to be understood and planned in one model, which strangely enough, not many people are doing at the moment. You could basically argue that there is a sort of a slider. This bar here in the middle, you can slide to the left and to the right. And not one of these things can be moved independently. If you do one, you will impact the others, either for good or for worse. So for instance, on the left side, you have sprawl, you have disconnection, spatial disconnection, you have congestion, you have conversion of agriculture, you have loss of fragmented, loss of ecologies and fragmentation of ecologies, flooding, etc. On the other hand, you could argue more compact development. Maybe I'll show you our 1 hour city loop, a sort of a mobility driven solution, car independence, multiple land use forms of agriculture or farming, reforestation, and ultimately room for the river, allowing for flooding, etc. So this bar can be moved, and if you want to achieve one of these things, you probably have to work on the others as well. We wanted to be as scientific as possible about this. And our initial goal was to kind of use GIS quite heavily. First, to look at the land use. Very simple. The Desa-Kota is a complex system. The land use is intricate. The R and the G and the B are always intertwined. So how can we begin to filter out what's happening where? Like, there are some areas that seem to be quite clear. Okay, maybe we can figure it out. We try to do it by hand. Okay, there are some sort of clusters, but then we said, no, we need to have a computer model that can help us do that. So we defined different mixtures. Every cluster has R and G and B, but each cluster has that in a different configuration, in a different proportionality, a different cocktail of land type. We did that for the whole of Java. We kept tweaking our model. I only showing you one or two slides, but we did many versions to kind of tweak how to interpret the land. Here you see it for our square. It's still a very pixelated kind of, let's say, complex picture that doesn't allow us yet to really interpret what's going on. So we continue to refine and also simplify. Ultimately, we came up with 5 land use types that we felt were fairly representational for what's going on in Java. So you see them here. I'll go through them very quickly. So there's the clusters mainly around the mountainous areas, incorporating the slope. Then there's a kind of, let's say, mountain villages around the volcanoes. Then there's the valley areas that are well accessible. And then there's the dispersed urbanized areas, or the peri-urban landscapes that many of them are kind of at the heart of where the Desa-Kotas are. Interestingly, as you see in that thin black line here, the box, a large chunk of what we believe is a land use type that is typical of the Desa-Kota occurs right here in central Java. So even though you have Desa-Kota, of course, pretty much everywhere, this is one where it's very much concentrated. And then the urban cores. Okay. So going fast forward a little bit, that kind of allowed us to say, okay, now we have a way to maybe define a commonality across the landscape that allows us to begin to formulate strategies that would be applicable on a larger scale. So we want to work bottom up. We're going to look at the very detailed conditions in the single village, but because we know they are part of a certain cluster, we believe that strategy can then be upscaled to become part of that color, this, for instance, orange cluster. So that's the one that has been our focus area, this orange. And our 10 by 10 cube here, that's the Borobudur, captures the bulk of that orange land use type, which is this kind of semi-urbanized or Desa-Kota type, which we then kind of begin to interpret along 3 axes. So we have the land use, and then we have the network. The network basically is the time component of our analysis, right? So we figure out what kind of road systems are in place, and then we want to include a time component for how efficient these road systems are. Simply saying we have roads is not enough. We need to say how fast can you get from any point to any other point. So the second step was the network analysis. I will show only a little bit. We effectively ripped the data from OpenStreetMap and interpreted along 8 steps. One is basically footpaths, and then you have small bike lanes and small roads, etc., going all the way up to number 8, which is the toll road. I'll show you kind of what I mean, but you know it better than I do. This is the toll road level 8 in the top here. This is the national road level 7, level 6, community road. Already a lot of activity on either side, very important. We saw this driving with Intan throughout the whole region yesterday. We kind of confirmed this is really a universal condition, activity aligning the national and the level 5 and 6 roads. Sorry, maybe a little bit of water, that'd be good. Going down to level 4, it gets more kind of community, already village level, it gets greener, less buildings along, and if there are buildings, they're kind of poor condition, maybe more residential. Level 3, very residential. Level 2, it's kind of, it's not even tarmac, it's just tiles or bricks, right? And level 1, this kind of micro kind of pathway. Now that is, has been our tool set to kind of interpret what are the most accessible points. This black outline is our orange bubble. The red box is our Borobudur site, and these little orange, yellowish bubbles are the intersections of road level 6 and 8, or in this case, level 6 and 4, level 5 and 7, etc. And the gray bubbles is the main industrial clusters around Yogyakarta. We try to interpret if there was a clear correlation between the location, the growth, the spontaneous settling of industrial activity along these intersections of certain road types. We only really kind of comfortably confirmed that surely along the toll road there is a clear clustering. That makes a lot of sense because these goods need to travel much further. The larger industrial output probably has to go to the main cities and to the air and seaports. Fast forward again. Other correlations are much less clear. We tried looking at all of them, but it's not so obvious. So we interpreted, we tried to introduce, sorry. We tried to introduce a model that can look beyond the main level 8 tollway and national level highways. Could we begin to analyze the intricate micro networks of the Desa-Kota? They're extremely fine-grained, they're extremely complex and beautiful, and therefore also very hard to really measure. So we built this model along between the Semarang and Yogyakarta, and figured out how far can you get within 1 hour, or rather I should say here, a 30-minute offset either way from the highway. That is the reality, right? So 2 times 30 minutes is 1 hour. That means we've kind of introduced a 1 hour loop that allows you to reach any point within the Desa-Kota to any other point within that boundary of the loop. That is interesting because it begins to reveal that the Desa-Kota is actually highly accessible, at least to itself. So initially, of course, the Desa-Kota was extremely autonomous, autarkic, feeding itself, providing in its own needs. And now as Indonesia, as Java and Central Java are becoming part of the global economic network, that self-sufficiency is being undermined, is eroding. Suddenly, goods that need to be produced need to be shipped further, putting pressure on this very fine-grained system, a system that wasn't really designed for big trucks, a system that was extremely efficient for cars, for little carts, pedestrians and bikes and scooters and motorbikes. So we've been modeling a little bit on that 1 hour city network. Most importantly, you see here this kind of the closeness parameter, and then I think we have another one. Oh no. In any case, this begins to allow an argument which is quite maybe radical, but that the tollway doesn't necessarily introduce new accessibility for everybody. It only offers a kind of quick linkage between main hubs, but not local to local. So fast forwarding finally to the initial ideas we have for a strategy, very briefly. We aim to operate at these 3 levels. On the first level, we try to kind of block trucks from entering this fine-grained system. Maybe we can absorb them by creating hubs. These hubs will probably have to be at strategic positions where you reach a lot of agricultural land. So food that is produced can be then put on a truck to the main cities quickly, and you can actually have perishables sold in the city, even though now that is too complicated. Secondly, we try to kind of limit growth along these corridors, trying to, let's say, redesign the intersections and the section of these roads in order to prevent sprawl. Now growth, urbanization is happening along these corridors wherever it can, wherever there is land available. So we're basically growing into a linear city. We think that by redesigning the section of the roads, we can prevent much of that type of growth. Then at the intersections, we can imagine some sort of hubs. I don't want to go into detail, but these hubs could then become community centers. They could become, sorry, move forward a little bit. They could become places for storage, etc. Oh, wonderful. And finally, cheers. Finally, we look at the micro scale of the individual village. This is our 10 by 10 square of the Desa-Kota. Within the Desa-Kota, we look at one specific village, but it's kind of important to see that village within its system. We're trying to split a road from the agricultural land use. You see very beautiful here on the right, the pattern of villages, their footprint versus the network that's available. And you see the growth over time. So on the left, all the current buildings within that Borobudur region. And on the right, when they were built. So 2008, not much activity in our village. But between 2008 and 2020, a lot of new buildings actually have been constructed. And just as I saw in China, it is happening kind of below the radar. It's almost impossible to really observe what's going on. It's kind of a blur. All this purple you see here is new after 2005. So that's a kind of a real concern. It's extremely hard to see. It's extremely hard to regulate, but it's very much there. It's kind of a new layer of growth. So could we imagine some sort of pedestrian oriented compact village development model for this landscape? Could we imagine these villages then being connected with new green corridors where you could do orchards, fruit farming, etc.? And could we imagine some sort of greenification of these small roads between the villages, creating a new green backbone for the Desa-Kota? These are all questions, and that's why I end with this slide. We have at this point more questions than answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville, for your very interesting presentation related about the first about China, and the second you tell us about the Metro Java 2045. And next, And next, I will give time. I will invite Fadjar as our discussant today to give your ideas, your opinion related to Mr. Neville presentation. Pak Fadjar, time and it's yours.
Well, it is interesting to see what I see as a kind of replication of Desa-Kota analysis in what you call in much larger scale. Maybe about 20 or 30 years ago, Desa-Kota was analyzed by Terry McGee based on what you call the development of small cities around a metropolitan area. But today, you, Neville, analyze the kind, the kind shape, the similar shape of urban growth in much larger cities in China using Chongqing and Chengdu and Chongqing. I don't know how to spell the two cities, yeah, but yeah, it is interesting to see the two cities to replicate the Desa-Kota analysis in the global China, or macro China, and then to compare it with the what we have in Indonesia today, especially in Java, using also a micro analysis in Borobudur area. But in my perception, these two differences perhaps, of course, give different result because they have different energy, source of energy. The two area, China and Java, they also have not only in terms of financial energy, but also the human capital energy. China is a much larger area compared to Java. Maybe China is about 10 times to Java in terms of the population, and also perhaps with the similar level of urbanization. And one the interesting point for me is why actually you do the comparison with the area, Borobudur area. Of course, Borobudur area is a kind of area that has impact from the global activities. But in Borobudur, the activities is tourism that will give different impact with the industrial activities, especially connected to the global activities, the global industrial activities. Maybe if we compare the Desa-Kota 2.0 that we have seen in China, compare with the situation in Kerawang, Bekasi, for example, the peripheral of mega city of Jakarta, will give different result. But still, I see a very interesting point of view to see how the the simplicity process that arrive in Borobudur to have the kind of explanation on how then the Desa-Kota 2.0 will come in Java, and perhaps it also could give some comparison or explanation to what we have the Desa-Kota 2.0 in China. But still, it is very interesting for me to see this very cerdik in English. Yes, it's kind of smart point of smart thinking to see how to explain the Desa-Kota 2.0. Yeah, especially what you explained before, that we have a very different urbanization process in Indonesia compared to China. I'm not sure, I don't know much about the urbanization process in China, whether it influenced more by the migration from rural area to urban area. But here in Indonesia, especially in Java, the urbanization process is much more influenced by the development, I mean the changing situation of rural area to urban, to more urbanized area. So the urban area become larger and larger from time to time, different with the situation in the developed countries that they could preserve the rural area, still become rural area. And perhaps, I don't know how the situation in China, perhaps they also could control the urban growth in a more strict way than what we have here in Indonesia. And talking to this urbanization process, what you mentioned before, the MUD, the market-driven unintentional development, much more become what you call a characteristic, significant characteristic in Indonesia, perhaps especially what you present before after 2005, the urban, the simple urban growth in Borobudur, for example, Borobudur area and many rural area coming more intense. I'm not quite sure, but perhaps it also related to the East Asian crisis. I mean the post-East Asian crisis, because at that time Indonesia have more settled economic situation after crisis, and the crisis bring many population in big cities back to the home country. So perhaps this is have relation with the 2000, after 2005 more intense development in the what we call the rural area, like in Borobudur. Why? Because in Borobudur we have many opportunities to do some investment over there because of the global tourism activities. And yeah, it is interesting to what you call, to analyze how then to the integration of the global top-down national building to the local bottom-up urban development, especially with the Indonesian character. I mean, in Java character. Do you have any more information about that, Neville?
Well, you raise an important point. I think that's very good for this discussion. Like, to what extent is there room for international comparison? I'm actually very critical. You know, much of the problems in the world have come from taking one regional solution and projecting it very far away onto another area. So I'm very critical. But what I like about the introduction of China within the context of Indonesia is that it allows us to begin to filter out some sort of universal conditions. So even China, which is a non-democracy, that is extremely effectively centrally planned, even China is not is growing incrementally, is growing piecemeal, organically, and it's not really getting the results that it thinks it's getting. So my argument then becomes, if China can do it, if China cannot plan really the way they want to, then nobody can, because they have all the tools, even more so than Holland, you know, where people need to listen to everybody, etc.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting starting point. Then what is left? For me, the time angle is very so these 2 points of land use as a general framework. What is how is the land use changing over time? That's something you can compare between regions. It's kind of an objective lens. And secondly, the this time-based approach that, okay, if you know the land use, that's great. Now the second step is, now we need to know the operations. How does that space work on a daily basis? How do people move through that space? How efficient is it calculated by time? So those two lenses, let's say, I feel are quite they're fair to compare them between regions, if it's Latin America or Holland or China or Indonesia. That's an objective tool to apply. Yeah.
But still, land use is depend on the activities who needs the place, the land, and the activities is also depend on the economic activities. I mean the economic growth in the area. We have China had very stable economic growth for long term, more than 2 decades perhaps, and Java also have good economic growth, but it was only until the late 90s, and after that Java has declined economic growth, even though then after 2005 Java has better economic growth than the period after the East Asia crisis. And yeah, it is also interesting for me to see the comparison between China and Borobudur, because the industrial effect on urbanization will give different impact with the tourism industry effect to the urbanization, even though the tourism industry derive from the global tourism activities.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. So I had this very silly diagram of this arrow splitting up, right?
Yeah.
So that's I think the point where we are now is like we need to figure out a certain land use, and as you mentioned, in relation to the local culturally defined activity of a certain area. For instance, in the traditional Desa-Kota, very autonomous, very localized, is now forced to become part of a global way of operating, where products have to be shipped out, have to be trucked, demand therefore logistic systems, demand road systems. That has it's almost inevitable, because we need to offer economic opportunity, we need to offer growth, but it also forces that land use system to become another one, to become part of the global land use taxonomy of land use systems, and therefore maybe become in a way comparable, because it is now happening in the same way as it is in Latin America or Southeast Asia, etc.
Do you I mean do you have any plan to do the another comparison with the more similar situation to China, or only with the Borobudur area?
Well, I'll be very honest. I've never done this comparison. This is only for you, especially only for week that I thought it would
I
be
see.
interesting to show these two. In reality,
Mhm.
you know, the Metro Java 2045 has a very scientific front end, which I haven't really shown because it's probably boring, but the kind of dry, solid analysis. And now we're moving to the village to do the data gathering with the community. And then we hope to formulate initial strategies, kind of carefully figuring out what is possible, what is smart. So no, my own background coming from China is just giving me a certain lens, but actually, no, it's more like a warning. Let's put it that way. Like China is defining how urbanization is happening in the world. China is knocking at the door at every developing country in the world, as we know, you know, and I'm like, watch out. They have things they do really well, but there are things that only work for a short time. And after 10, 20 years, you see the problems occurring, and sometimes even sooner.
Yes, of course. That's why I see this comparison actually is a smart analysis. What I said before, comparing China with the big, huge urbanization process and fast urbanization process compared to what we have in Borobudur, that much more simple than we have in China. Then perhaps with the what you call the lesser pace of growth, then we can see how the process in more detail. Especially, could you please show us again the situation of Java that you have before the slide with the urban core and other urban area.
Let me see.
I'm not sure in what.
Hope it works.
The slide that you show us, that much northern coastal of Java will become an urban area. There are some urban core, Jakarta, also Cirebon and Semarang and Surabaya in the eastern part, but we have much bigger before this one, if I'm not wrong, the whole Java.
Oh, right. Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
The whole Java.
Perhaps that one, the left bottom, the bottom left.
Bottom left. This one?
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. This one. We can see here the prospect of the urban growth in Java. I mean the urban formation in Java, that perhaps will become what Pak Tommy Firman say, and as the mega, not mega city, but the mega urbanization of Java, connecting most of the cities, especially in the northern part of Java, big and small cities from Jakarta to the east, connecting, for example, there, Cirebon and also Tegal, Semarang, and then go through the north area to Surabaya, and also some of area in the western part in Bandung, and also in Yogyakarta and Surakarta, and also in Kediri. There are perhaps the prospect of the urban formation in Java. What if this become the real progress of urbanization in Java? Then what you concern is very.
I'm more skeptical of, strange enough, even though I use the term mega urban region, etc., a lot, in reality, I'm skeptical of indeed these very big metro diagrams of metro regions, if they are presented as some sort of emerging new cities. That I don't think that's the case at all. I do believe in the corridors, especially the twin cores, right? When there's growth between two main cities that are slowly growing together, such as we saw also in China. I think that does happen in Java, but in my opinion, the real challenge is that the growth is far more fragmented and far more dispersed.
Yes.
Than those type of diagrams indicate. There are some good diagrams. I think we also saw in a shared presentation at some point of what they call sort of human influence. I think those are very telling because they begin to reveal it's not just about where is city, it's also about where do we impact, for instance, agriculture in, for instance, water, etc.
Yes, of course, because in our
we're being too long, I think.
Okay.
Mainly me.
Yeah, because I don't know until what time we will do the discussion.
I think we can talk forever.
Yeah, I think we should invite participants, yeah, Mbak Intan and Neville. Your presentation comparing the China experience is really interesting, Neville. Thank you for sharing that to us. Please, yeah, maybe Intan would like to invite.
I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you, Pak Fadjar and Pak Neville, for the fruitful discussion. So the next, I will invite our participants who want to ask about our today discussions. Anybody wants to? If you want to ask, just raise your hands. Maybe there is one participants on the chat. Wildan Bramantio, do you want to ask about your question here? Okay. Actually, maybe I want to read the question from Wildan Bramantio. The question is, on the last slide, the rural land use development changes that are detected almost half the original size and aggregately comparably large. I see this phenomenon like an urbanization, but contained in the form of rural sprawl, not urban sprawl. As if we total the resulting additions since 2005, it covers probably several square kilometer. And then, in my opinion, it is not efficient as with this much development, land use developing as rural does not increase economics of scale, but more beneficial to more people, or inherently balanced development. My question this way, what should be focused by government on its investment for rural to develop better, or rural development should be restricted and channeled into nearby city or new city development?
Can I read it somewhere?
Okay.
Or you want to, maybe you got it?
What should we focus by? What should the government focus?
Could you please copy the question to the
Okay,
chat?
got it.
Yeah. Okay. That's the question. What should we focus by the government on its investment for roads to develop better?
Well, let me be very honest. I do not understand or even pretend to understand the local governmental structures. I've tried to understand, but it's complicated. And so hopefully that's also a kind of input from the partners and from the workshop. But in a nutshell, I do know there is a need for this cross-scalar approach, right? Where information has to begin to flow in two directions, not just top-down, but also bottom-up. And it seems to me that in order also to guide investment smarter, we need to have a focus on this kind of intermediary or meso level between the local and the national, a sort of maybe regency level that is now quite weak, as I understand it, where information is gathered and is assimilated, and then there is a strategic response that has enough understanding of local and national conditions that it can funnel funds in a smart way.
Okay, thank you. The last question from Burina Kurniati on the chat box. How can integrated Desa-Kota be implemented if a toll road is built that reduce accessibility between Desa and Kota?
Yeah, I rushed through the final part. But our network analysis suggests that the efficiency gains from the toll road are limited mainly to the urban cores. So the Desa-Kota doesn't really gain much from a new toll road. That's kind of the first conclusion. The second conclusion is that we could maybe, hopefully, introduce a way to limit the negative impact of the roads, of new tollways and large road systems on the Desa-Kota, and at the same time give them more benefit. And what we're thinking now is to have this kind of these intermediary hubs that sit on strategic locations where food and produce can be shipped to these hubs efficiently with small vehicles on small roads, then transported into maybe a chilled storage, and straight onto a large truck that goes onto the tollway. So in that sense, a new, very streamlined, limited access of trucks into the Desa-Kota, limiting their impact, and at the same time opening up the Desa-Kota to have access to these global networks. So that's in general terms the idea, and now we need to figure out if that's actually realistic.
Okay, thank you. For the very last question from Bu Dona, please.
Thank you, Mbak Intan. Thank you very much, Pak Neville. Your presentation is very interesting for me because, yeah, it's quite give me a new perspective about how you see about the Desa-Kota and how you can value through land use as well as the transportation. And then I think we also need to consider about the locality and the local culture, because in rural area, especially, for example, in Borobudur area, they maybe rely on agriculture, and with Javanese culture has a certain value, maybe different with I don't know, China or Brazil, but I I do agree with you as well. There is some universal value as well, and it share the same or has the same characteristic. But for example, in rural area in Java, for example, in Borobudur, I think also they have used the motorcycle excessively, and they need a motorcycle to transport from one place to another place, because sometimes there are some rural transport, but they feel like in other Indonesian city, they feel that, for example, with motorcycle, it's faster and more can fulfill their needs to transport from one place to another place with the faster way. And that's why maybe it's quite different sometimes, for example, for example, in British or in England or Scotland rural area, the rural area is become a richer area. I mean, it seems that the rich people live in a rural area, but in Indonesia, I think because the land ownership is like, it's not in a wide area. So sometimes in rural area become more poverty rather in a rural urban area. So I think we should consider that one. But the point is, another point, I think the most important and interesting one from your point is about the dichotomy between globalization, global smart part in one side, and in another side is rural, informal, and I think there's no black and white here, but I think I do agree with you as well. Sometimes we need like a prescription or a policy or program that can increase their access through, for example, with rural broadband, for example. But we need to know as well, I think we need to think as well that there's a continuum between the global and the rural or Desa-Kota. So there's a gray or there's not in a black and white, but there's a slow movement, slow change. And I think in every steps, we need different types of, for example, recommendation or policy. So I think it's will be interesting point if you can maybe take a further study based on that one. So it will be more precisely going through the solution of the problem of each steps or stage or each place in another place of rural area in Indonesia. But overall, I think it's very good studies, and thank you very much for your sharing of thought. Thank you, Pak Neville.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just add one tiny thing. This was my initial concern, that we're in a way we're not dealing with an urbanization challenge, but a lifestyle challenge, right? Where motorization is the one thing I feel quite comfortable predicting is going to kick in hard, and I know that because we've done a similar project about 8 years ago in Mumbai, and we felt we were just on time to address that change from walking and biking to taking the car, and we weren't too late. It happened so quickly that almost overnight everybody owned a car and everybody wanted to be in that traffic jam, and that's really a doomsday scenario that I think we need to anticipate if we don't work hard to prevent it.
Okay, So thank you for all participants who raised questions in these sessions. And then we finally jump to the last session. We are in the closing events. Maybe yeah, thank you very much, Pak Neville, Pak Fadjar, for our fruitful discussion today. Before we close today's discussion,
Prof.
maybe Prof. G want to,
Yes,
yeah, please time is your Prof.
yes. Thank you very much. I'm very interesting for your presentations. Yeah. This in the China, yeah, we have visited in China in the year of 2000 with our student also in the triangle of the Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou. Yeah, Guangzhou is we visited this triangles. We know that's about the rapid urbanization. Yeah, but the Shenzhen is developed. Is developed when in 1998. Yeah. But now we that Shenzhen and make make the growth to the Guangzhou, yeah, with the Guangzhou and make the linear urbanization. Yeah, but you know there's you know there's in China says about landowner. Yeah, landowner in China says the landowner is by the government. Yeah, there is no private owner. I think there's the planning in China says it's easy to implement it because the land is is on the problem of the land. Yeah, the problem is not problem because the land is owned by the government. It's different with our country. Yeah, so it's the private owner is many so difficult to implement the planning. Yes, yes. And the second I give you information that there is two different of semi-urbanization. Yeah, what we call the semi-urbanization is by the extensions of the urbanized area to the rural. Is we call the urban extension. Yeah. We call that urban extension is a suburbanization. Yeah, the words. There's a top-down development from the center to the rural. Yeah, and at the second we can call the rural urbanizations. Yeah, what's about rural urbanization? Rural urbanization is a capacity of the rural area to develop urban with the self capacity. It's mean the capacity is from the rural itself. Yeah, I think that's all the urbanization in Borobudur. Yeah, there's many what we call the rural urbanizations. Yes, because there's many rural area have capacity potential for development, tourism development. Yeah, there is a local capacity and to develop urban. Yeah, and then I think that is different with the suburbanization. Yeah, I think the suburbanization is the urbanization is came from the urbanized area, like in the peripheric development, etc. Yeah, so the there is a two different type of rural semi-urban, yeah, semi-urban. We call it semi-urban. Semi-urban, the first development, the suburbanization, and the second is rurbanization. And the development from the Semarang, etc., and Semarang is the development of semi-urbanization is a suburbanization, is how the urbanized area is developed from the center to the periphery. It's called the expansion of the urbanization. Yeah? And it's different with the like a Borobudur, maybe a Magelang, etc. It's local rural development is rural urbanization is they can develop reserve the potential of rural area to become urban. Yeah? I think that's you know that the suburbanization is more stronger than the rural urbanization. Yeah, like Jakarta, Jabodetabek, etc. is this is suburbanization, the expansions of the urban area. Huh? So yes, I agree also the problem of the connections. I think the global connection is very important. If you know there's a connection on the Semarang, Jogja, and Solo, and this triangle, there is a global connection. Yeah, because from the the big city, yes, and then and also there's rural urbanization. There's Borobudur and local rural is the many objective of the tourism. Yeah, tourism of the Desa-Wisata, as we call the rural tourism. Yeah, we call the Desa-Wisata is the rural tourism. This rural urbanization, and so we can this method is developed. So you can see that the Desa-Kota in the Borobudur area. Yeah, we call also the triangle of the Semarang, Jogja, and Solo. Yeah, Semarang, Jogja is called a triangle. We also call the triangle of Merapi Merbabu, because you see that's in the sun and the center of this area. There's two mountains, very big mountains, the Merapi and Merbabu. Yeah, so the triangle is we call the triangle of the Merapi Merbabu. Yeah, yes. I think that's there's the development of the rural area, like in Borobudur as center, yeah. Compare with the development of the Semarang, etc. as Semarang, like development of the metropolitan area is, I think the metropolitan area is more faster than rural urbanization in Borobudur, I think, yeah. Yes, I think that's rural urbanization in the Borobudur area is lower than suburbanization in Semarang. Yeah, Semarang and we call see the we call also that Semarang and in the north coast, yeah, north coast, yeah. There's a development of the development belt, yeah. Development belt is from the north coast area, from the Jakarta, Semarang, and yeah, and Surabaya. I think Jakarta and Jakarta Semarang is as a linear development is more faster than urbanization in Borobudur. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. My opinion. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Yono. Maybe Neville want to a little bit short response.
Maybe I have a very short response. Thank you very much. It's a very kind and very comprehensive closing statement. I think from my side, it's simple. Yes, life is much easier for planners if the government owns the land, but it doesn't allow for a community-based solution. And I think that's what is needed today, and certainly here in Indonesia.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Neville, for your response. And we are in the closing session. Maybe I would like to invite Bu Wiwandari to give want to close this event, or Pak Ruko want to give your close statement related to today's discussion? Just short, yes, short statement to close this event. Thank you, Pak Ruko.
Okay, thank you so much for the time, and I think it was a really super interesting discussion and topic that we have today. So we're really grateful for this event and the presentation from Pak Neville. Thank you so much for your contribution in our activity today, and as well as to Pak Fadjar and all of the participants of this event. Yes, I think that's all that I can say. Thank you so much again, and yes.
Okay.
Time is back to you, Intan.
Closing statement, and to close these events, maybe we to all participants maybe can open the camera. We have the photo sessions. This is our, yes, what we do before our close the event. Okay. Maybe the other participants, no, it's enough. Okay, let us take the picture. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you for all participants who come into forum diskusi ilmiah perencanaan, and see you on the next event. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you.